The year was 1875, and in the New Mexico Territory. The wind did not merely blow, it scoured. It carried the red dust of the high desert into every crease of clothing, every line on a face, and every crack in the timber frames of Red Mesa. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that demanded payment in sweat and blood for the privilege of standing upon it. Rowan Hart stood behind the counter of her father's general store, watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of afternoon sunlight that cut through the hazy air. At 23 years of age, Rowan had learned that silence was often the loudest sound in a town like this. She ran a hand over the rough wood of the counter, her fingers stained slightly with ink. Beneath the ledger of grain sacks and coffee tins, hidden carefully out of sight, lay a book on territorial law and a hand-drawn map of the proposed railroad lines. The town of Red Mesa was holding its breath. It was a settlement clinging to the edge of civilization, surviving on the meager commerce of a stagecoach stop, the thirst of passing miners, and the desperate hope that the silver mines to the north would finally open. But more than silver, the town hungered for iron. The railroad was coming, or so the rumors claimed, and with it would come money, liquor, and the end of their isolation. However, the Iron Horse needed land to run upon, and that land belonged to the Navajo. The bell above the door jingled, a sharp, intrusive sound that broke Rowan's reverie. She did not need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, deliberate boot steps and the smell of stale whiskey and gun oil announced Sheriff Cole Maddox long before his shadow fell across the floorboards. Following him, light and precise like a fox stalking a coop, was Mayor Elias Pritchard. "Afternoon, Miss Hart," Pritchard said. His voice was smooth, cultivated in the east but hardened by the west. He offered a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Is your father in?" Rowan straightened her spine. She kept her face neutral, though a cold knot tightened in her stomach. "He is in the back, checking the inventory on the flour barrels. We are running low." "Inventory," Sheriff Maddox grunted. He leaned against a support post, his thumbs hooked into a belt that strained against his paunch. His face was flushed, likely from a midday visit to the saloon, but his eyes were sharp and cruel. "He ought to be worrying about more than flour. We have reports of savages near the ridge again." Rowan felt the familiar bristle of irritation. "They are likely just hunting parties. Sheriff, the treaty allows them—" "The treaty," Maddox interrupted, spitting the word out as if it were a piece of gristle. "That paper is worth less than the ink used to sign it. They are scouting. Girl, looking for weaknesses. You would do well to keep that pretty head of yours down and your doors locked." Pritchard stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on the counter. "Now, Cole, do not frighten the poor girl. Miss Hart, the sheriff, is only concerned for the safety of the town. With the railroad contract so close to being finalized, we cannot afford any incidents. The company needs to know that the territory is secure. If the Navajo refuse to relocate peacefully, we must show that they are a threat to civilized progress." Rowan looked from one man to the other. It was a performance, a rehearsed duet she had heard too many times. Pritchard provided a reasonable excuse, and Maddox provided the threat of violence. They were manufacturing a war because peace was not profitable. "I will tell my father you stopped by," Rowan said, her voice cool. Pritchard tipped his hat. "You do that. Tell him the town council meets at 7 o'clock tonight. We need every business owner to vote on the petition for military support." They left as they came, leaving the air in the store feeling heavier than before. Rowan waited until the door latched shut before she pulled her map out from under the ledger. She traced the line of the proposed track with her finger. It cut straight through the red canyons to the west, the very heart of the winter grazing lands for the local Navajo clans. "They are going to steal it," she whispered to the empty room. "They are going to take it all." Her father, Thomas Hart, emerged from the back room a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a man worn down by grief and labor. His shoulders stooped as if the sky pressed too hard upon him. He had been a cavalryman once, decades ago, But the fire had left him when Rowan's mother died. Now, he only wanted peace. "Was that the mayor?" Thomas asked, his voice weary. "And the sheriff?" Rowan replied, "They want you at the meeting tonight. They want to vote on calling in more soldiers." Thomas sighed and leaned against the shelves. "Maybe it is for the best." "Rowan, people are scared. They say the Eagle Rider was seen near the dried creek bed just 2 days ago." "The Eagle Rider?" Rowan repeated, shaking her head. "Father, that is a ghost story. A myth they spun to scare children and justify shooting at anything that moves. People claim he is real," Thomas insisted, though his tone was gentle. "They say he rides a painted stallion and can put an arrow through a man's eye from 300 yards. They say he leads a band of renegades who answer to no chief. If he exists, he is likely just a man trying to protect his home," Rowan argued. She moved around the counter to straighten a row of canned peaches. "Do you remember the family that used to come here to trade, the ones with the little girl who liked the peppermint sticks I learned to say thank you and water in their tongues? They were not monsters. Father, they were people." "Rowan," Thomas said sharply, his eyes darting to the window as if fearing the town was listening. "You must stop speaking like that. It is dangerous. The mood in this town is turning ugly. If you are heard defending them, they will turn on you too. Please, for my sake, just keep your head down." Rowan looked at her father, seeing the fear etched into the lines of his face. She loved him, but she hated the silence he wore like armor. "I will be careful," she promised, though she knew in her heart that being careful and being silent were two different things. Later that afternoon, the heat became oppressive. The sun was a white-hot coin stamped into the blue sky, baking the earth until it cracked. Rowan had a delivery to make to the Golden Nugget Saloon, a crate of tobacco and dried spices that the owner had requested. The saloon was the center of life in Red Mesa, a place where the noise was loud enough to drown out the wind. As Rowan entered through the side door, the smell of sawdust, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies assaulted her. She found her friend Elsie wiping down a table near the back. Elsie was a few years older than Rowan, with hair the color of straw and a smile that she wielded like a shield. She looked up and winked as Rowan set the crate down. "You are a savior, honey," Elsie said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Old man Miller has been yelling about his spices for an hour. You would think he is cooking for the governor, not a bunch of miners who would eat shoe leather if you salted it enough." Rowan smiled, grateful for the normalcy. "Is it bad today?" Elsie leaned in close, lowering her voice. "Worse than bad. Captain Briggs is here with 3 of his officers. They are at the bar now, drinking like they are trying to forget their names." Rowan glanced toward the bar. Captain Harlan Briggs stood tall among his men, his blue uniform dusty but his posture rigid. He was a man who believed in order, specifically the order that came from the barrel of a Springfield rifle. "I heard them talking," Elsie whispered, pretending to rearrange the salt cellar. "Briggs was telling the mayor that if the town provides the provocation, the army will provide the solution. They use that word, provocation. They want to fight," Rowan said, her blood running cold. "They need the Navajo to strike first so they can slaughter them with a clear conscience. And there is talk of the Eagle Rider again," Elsie added, her eyes wide. "One of the drovers swore he saw a warrior watching the herds from the high cliffs. Said he sat on his horse like a statue made of stone. They call him a savage. Rowan. A raider who kills for sport." "He is a convenient boogeyman," Rowan murmured. "Just what they need to scare the town into signing those petitions." Elsie grabbed Rowan's arm. "Just be careful walking home." "All right, the soldiers are rowdy, and the sun is going down." "The shadows play tricks on men who have had too much to drink." Rowan nodded and squeezed her friend's hand. "I will be fine. I know the way." But as she left the saloon, the sun was already bleeding into the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. The wind had picked up, howling through the gaps in the buildings like a mourning woman. Rowan hurried toward the edge of town. Her father's store was near the center, but they lived in a small cabin on the outskirts, closer to the open prairie. She preferred the walk usually, It gave her a moment to breathe away from the dust of commerce. But tonight, the words she had heard in the store and the saloon echoed in her mind. Provocation, savage, threat. She took a shortcut behind the livery stables, a path that wound through a cluster of large sandstone boulders before reaching her home. The air was cooling rapidly, the desert night reclaiming the heat of the day. Suddenly, she heard voices, rough, slurred voices, and a sound that made her stomach turn, the dull thud of a boot hitting flesh. Rowan froze. She crouched behind a large slab of rock, peering into the gloom. In a small clearing ahead, 2 soldiers were circling a figure on the ground. It was a Navajo boy, no older than 16. Dressed in simple buckskins, he was curled into a ball, trying to protect his head as the soldiers took turns kicking him. "Get up, Redskin," one of the soldiers shouted, swaying on his feet. He held a bottle in one hand. "Thought you could spy on us. Thought you could sneak into town and steal." The boy said nothing, only gasping for air. There was a small sack of flour spilled on the ground near him. He had not been stealing. He had likely traded for it and was trying to return to his family. Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs. Anger flared hot and bright in her chest, warring with fear. She looked around for a weapon, a rock, anything. She could not just watch this. She took a step forward, her boot crunching on the gravel. But before she could reveal herself, the wind shifted. It was not a sound, but a change in the pressure of the air. The soldiers did not notice, but Rowan saw him. From the top of the highest boulder, a shadow detached itself from the night. He dropped silently, landing between the soldiers and the boy with the grace of a mountain cat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark leather that blended with the twilight. A scarf covered the lower half of his face, revealing only high cheekbones and eyes that glittered in the moonlight. He held a bow, not drawn, but gripped with an easy familiarity that was more terrifying than if he had been aiming. The soldiers stumbled back, startled by the sudden apparition. "What in the hell?" the first soldier slurred, dropping his bottle. It shattered on a rock. "Who are you?" The warrior did not speak. He stood perfectly still, a barrier of flesh and will between the tormentors and their victim. "It is him," the second soldier whispered, sobering instantly. He reached for the pistol at his belt. "It is the rider!" The soldier drew his weapon, but he was slow, clumsy with drink. The warrior moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast to follow. In one heartbeat, he stepped forward. In the next, the soldier's pistol was flying through the air, knocked from his hand by the heavy limb of the bough. The warrior spun, sweeping the legs out from under the second soldier before he could even raise his fists. Both men hit the dust hard. He could have killed them. Rowan saw the knife at his belt, the hatchet lawfully tied to his side. He could have ended them in a second, but he did not. He stood over them, his chest heaving slightly, radiating a cold, restrained power. He gestured sharply to the ground, a silent command to stay down. Then he turned to the boy. He reached down, pulling the youth to his feet with a gentleness that contradicted the violence of a moment ago. He spoke a few words in Dine, low and guttural, and the boy nodded, scrambling away into the darkness. Clutching his torn shirt, the soldiers were scrambling backward, crawling in the dirt like crabs, terrified. They found their footing and ran, stumbling back toward the lights of the town, shouting about an ambush. The warrior watched them go. Then, slowly, he turned his head. He looked directly at the boulder where Rowan was hiding. Rowan stopped breathing. She knew she was hidden in the shadows, yet she felt exposed. He knew she was there. He had known the whole time. For a long, suspended moment, their eyes locked across the distance. Even with the scarf covering his face, she could see the intensity of his gaze. It was not the look of a savage animal. It was calm, calculated. There was anger there, yes, but it was a cold, intelligent anger. And then he nodded. A barely perceptible tilt of his head. A whistle pierced the night, sharp and commanded. A horse, dark as midnight with no saddle, trotted out from the rocks. The warrior grasped the mane and swung himself up in one fluid motion, as if he and the beast were one creature. He turned the horse toward the open plains, toward the red cliffs that loomed like fortress walls in the distance. In seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the vastness of the American West. Rowan sank back against the cold stone of the boulder, her legs trembling. "Eagle Rider," she whispered, the name tasting different on her tongue now. The town called him a monster. The mayor called him a threat to civilization. But Rowan had seen the truth. He had saved a boy and spared 2 men who deserved to die. He was not a raider. He was a protector. And now, she carried a secret that weighed heavier than any sack of flour. The war Pritchard and Maddox were trying to manufacture was built on a lie. The enemy was not a savage horde. The enemy was right here, in the sheriff's office, wearing a badge and a suit. Rowan stood up, dusting the red dirt from her skirt. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, vibrating clarity. She looked out toward the horizon where he had vanished. "Be safe," she said into the wind. She turned and walked back toward her home, her boots striking the earth with a new determination. The conflict had begun, but for the first time, Rowan Hart knew exactly which side of the line she was standing on. 2 nights after the incident at the Rocks, the air in the Golden Nugget Saloon was thick enough to chew. It was a mixture of cheap tobacco smoke, the sour tang of spilled beer, and the nervous sweat of men who gambled with money they did not have. Rowan was there to collect a payment for a sack of sugar her father had delivered earlier. She stood near the back of the room, hidden by the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain that separated the main floor from the private poker rooms. She intended to leave quickly, but a familiar voice drifting through the thin partition froze her boots to the floorboards. "If the people are frightened enough, they will sign anything we give them." It was Mayor Elias Pritchard. His voice was not the booming baritone he used for speeches on the town steps. It was low, serpentine, and cold. Rowan pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew she should run, but the pull of the truth was stronger than her fear. Fear is a useful tool. "Elias," Sheriff Cole Maddox replied, the clink of a bottle hitting a glass punctuating his words. "But anger is better. A frightened man hides. An angry man picks up a gun. They will have their anger." A third voice cut in. It was Captain Harlan Briggs. "The convoy moves on Thursday. We will take the route through the Red Canyon. It is close enough to the Navajo grazing lands to make the accusation plausible." Rowan held her breath. The Red Canyon. That was where the families she had traded with years ago often camped during the dry season. "And the gold?" Maddox asked. "It would be a shame to lose $10,000 to a fire." "There is no gold, you fool," Pritchard snapped. "Just crates of rocks and a few empty strongboxes. We burn the wagons, leave a few surplus cavalry uniforms torn up to look like struggle, and scatter some arrows. By Friday morning, every man in Red Mesa will be begging the governor to drive the Navajo into the dust." Rowan felt a wave of nausea roll over her. It was not just a skirmish they were planning. It was a fabrication designed to justify a slaughter. They were going to fake an attack, blame it on Atzanez and his people, and use the outrage to seize the land for the railroad. She slipped away before they could finish their whiskey, moving through the crowded saloon like a ghost. She found Elsie near the kitchen door, her face pale. "You look like you have seen a dead man," Elsie whispered, gripping Rowan's arm. "Worse," Rowan replied, her voice barely audible. "I saw the men who are going to make the dead men." She pulled Elsie into the alleyway behind the saloon, under the light of a sliver moon. Rowan spilled everything she had heard, the fake shipment, the Red Canyon, the framing of the Navajo. Elsie covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "Rowan, you cannot say a word. If Maddox finds out you know, he will kill you. He will say it was an accident, or that you ran off." "I cannot just let them do this," Rowan argued, though her hands were shaking. "Innocent people will die. The soldiers will ride into the canyon and shoot anything that moves. And if you speak up," Elsie countered, tears welling in her eyes, "who will believe the daughter of a grocer against the mayor and a captain of the United States Cavalry? They will call you a traitor." They will ruin your father." The mention of her father struck Rowan like a physical blow. Thomas Hart was old and frail. He could not withstand the wrath of men like Maddox. "I will not go to the sheriff," Rowan said, her jaw setting. "But I will not forget." That night, beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, Rowan hid a small leather-bound journal. In it, she wrote down the date, the names she had heard, and the specific details of the Red Canyon plot. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was the only weapon she had. 3 days later, the storm broke. It began with a rider galloping down the main street, his horse lathered in white sweat, shouting that the payroll convoy had been ambushed. By noon, a somber procession entered Red Mesa. 2 charred wagons were dragged by mules, and slung over the backs of pack horses were the bodies of 4 soldiers. The town erupted. Men ran to their homes to fetch rifles. Women gathered in the street, weeping and clutching their children. Captain Briggs stood on the boardwalk in front of the telegraph office, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Look," Briggs shouted, gesturing to the burned wreckage. "Look at what the savages have done. They attacked a peaceful transport. They slaughtered good men for gold." Rowan stood on the periphery of the crowd, watching closely. She saw the arrow shafts sticking out of the wagon wood. They were too uniform, the fletching too pristine. But what caught her eye were the tracks left by the horses that had dragged the wagons in. She walked closer, ignoring her father's tug on her sleeve. She looked at the ground where the debris had been dumped. Amidst the chaos, there was a muddy boot print near the wagon tongue, and next to it, the clear, curved indentation of an iron horseshoe. Navajo ponies were unshod. They did not leave iron prints. "Those horses were shod," Rowan said aloud. It was not a shout, but in the sudden lull of the crowd, it carried like a gunshot. Captain Briggs turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. Sheriff Maddox stepped down from the boardwalk, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "What did you say, girl?" Maddox asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I said the horses that attacked this wagon were shod," Rowan repeated, her voice trembling but clear. "And look at the burns. That implies kerosene. The Navajo use pitch and dry grass. This fire was started with refined oil." A murmur went through the crowd. Maddox's face turned a violent shade of red. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You seem to know a lot about how these savages fight," Maddox spat. "Maybe a little too much." "I know what I see," Rowan said, holding her ground. "And I see a lie." "She is confused," Thomas Hart stammered, stepping in front of his daughter. "Sheriff, please, she is just upset by the violence. She does not know what she is saying." "I think she knows exactly what she is saying," Mayor Pritchard interjected, stepping out from the telegraph office. He looked at Rowan with a pitying expression that chilled her blood. "It breaks my heart to say this, neighbors, but we have suspected for some time that there is a spy among us, someone sending signals to the raiders, someone telling them when the shipments leave." The crowd turned. The sympathy evaporated, replaced by suspicion and fear. "She has always defended them," a woman shouted from the back. "I saw her talking to that Indian family years ago." "Traitor!" another man yelled. Rowan felt the walls closing in. "No, I am trying to tell you the truth. Look at the tracks." "Seize her," Pritchard commanded softly. Maddox lunged. Thomas tried to push the sheriff back, shouting for him to stop. Maddox did not hesitate. He drove the back of his hand across Thomas's face. The old man crumbled to the dust, blood pouring from his lip. "Father!" Rowan screamed. She tried to rush to him, but rough hands grabbed her arms. Maddox seized her by the hair, yanking her head back. "You want to be with the savages?" Maddox hissed into her ear. "Then we will treat you like one." They dragged her toward the center of the square. Rowan fought them, kicking and twisting, but she was one woman against the fury of a town that needed a scapegoat. They pulled her to the old hitching post in the center of the plaza, a thick beam of weathered oak that had been used to whip horse thieves in the early days. "String her up," someone shouted. Maddox produced a length of rough hemp rope. He grabbed Rowan's wrists and hauled them high above her head. She cried out as her shoulders popped, the strain agonizing. He lashed her hands to the crossbeam, pulling the knots tight enough to bite into her skin. Rowan hung there, her toes barely scraping the dirt, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair wild across her face. "Please, let me go," she begged, the tears finally spilling over. "I have done nothing wrong, please." A clod of dirt struck her cheek. Then a small stone hit her shoulder. She looked up through the haze of pain and saw the faces of people she had known her whole life. The baker, the woman who sold quilts. They were not looking at her. They were looking at a monster they had created in their own minds. Indian lover. Spy. Rowan closed her eyes, the shame burning hotter than the midday sun. She realized with a crushing despair that the truth did not matter to them. They did not want justice. They wanted blood. They wanted someone to blame for their fear. And she was the easiest target. The sun beat down on her. Time stretched and warped. Her arms went numb, then burned with fire. She sagged against the rough wood, her throat raw from sobbing. She waited for the final blow, for the shot or the rope around her neck. Then, the silence came. It did not fall gradually. It slammed into the square like a physical force. The shouting stopped. The jeering died in their throats. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Rowan forced her heavy eyelids open. At the far end of the main street, shimmering in the heat waves rising from the earth, was a horse. It was not a cavalry mount. It was a Mustang, painted with symbols of red and black clay, and on its back sat a nightmare. Atsanez rode into Red Mesa. He was alone. He did not charge. He did not scream. He simply walked his horse down the center of the street, the hooves clicking rhythmically on the hard-packed earth. He wore a dark buckskin shirt that hugged his broad chest, and his hair was bound back with leather. A quiver of arrows was slung across his back, and a Winchester rifle rested in a scabbard by his leg. But it was his presence that held the town hostage. He radiated a lethal calm, a predator walking through a pen of sheep. The crowd parted. Men who had been shouting for blood moments ago stumbled back, their hands hovering near their guns but too terrified to draw. This was the Eagle Rider. This was the ghost who haunted their nightmares, and he had ridden into their stronghold in broad daylight. Sheriff Maddox stepped out from the boardwalk, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his Colt. "You," he croaked. "You are a dead man. Savage." Atsa did not look at Maddox. He did not look at the soldiers who were freezing on the periphery, unsure of whether to fire and risk a massacre in the crowded street. He looked only at Rowan. He stopped his horse 10 feet from the post. He slid from the saddle with a fluid grace that made no sound. He walked past the stunned townsfolk, past the sputtering sheriff, straight to the girl tied to the wood. Rowan looked into his eyes. They were dark obsidian, unreadable and deep. Up close, she saw the faint scar running down his jawline. She saw the dust in his eyelashes. He smelled of sage and wood smoke and horse. For a second, she thought he would kill her. Perhaps he thought she was part of the trap. Atsa turned his back to her, facing Maddox in the crowd. He spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the terrified silence. His English was accented but perfect. "Untie her," he said, "or I will." Maddox laughed, a high, nervous sound. "You think you can give orders here? I will see you hang next to her." The sheriff started to raise his gun. Atsa moved. It was the same blurring speed Rowan had seen in the rocks. A knife appeared in his hand, a heavy blade with a handle of elk horn. He did not throw it at the sheriff. He spun around and slashed the rope binding Rowan's wrists. It was a single, violent stroke, precise as a surgeon's cut. The hemp severed instantly. Rowan crumpled. Her legs gave way, numbness preventing her from standing. She fell forward, bracing for the impact of the hard ground. She never hit the dirt. Strong arms caught her. Atsa caught her against his chest, holding her up when her own body failed her. The contact was shocking, the heat of him, the solid strength of his frame. Rowan gasped, clutching at his leather shirt to keep from falling. Her head spun. "Please, let me go," she whispered again, the words a broken reflex, thinking he was taking her as a hostage. Atsa looked down at her. His expression softened. Just for a fraction of a second, the anger in his eyes remained. but it was directed outward, at the world. Not at her. "I am letting you go," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. "From them?" He looked up at the line of soldiers now raising their rifles at the end of the street. He looked at the sheriff, who was cocking his pistol. He looked back down at the woman trembling in his arms, the woman who had tried to speak the truth when no one else would. "But I need your answer," Atsa said, his gaze locking onto hers, intense and demanding. "Ride with me or die here with their lies." Rowan looked at the town. She saw Pritchard's cold calculation. She saw the hatred in the eyes of her neighbors. She saw her father, weeping in the dust, too broken to save her. She looked back at the warrior. He was offering her nothing but uncertainty, a life on the run, a life in the wild. But in his eyes, she saw the only honest thing she had seen in days. Rowan gripped his arm. She straightened her legs, finding strength she did not know she possessed. "I will ride," she whispered. The moment Rowan Hart said, "I will ride," the world dissolved into a chaos of motion and noise. Atsanez did not wait for her to second-guess her decision. He leaned down from his painted stallion, his arm sweeping out like the wing of the predator he was named for. His hand, calloused and strong, gripped her forearm, with a strength that stole the breath from her lungs. He swung her up behind him. Rowan scrambled to find purchase, her skirts tangling around her legs. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the rough leather of his shirt. He smelled of wood smoke, sage, and the musk of a hard-ridden horse beneath her cheek. She could feel the powerful, rhythmic thud of his heart, steady and unhurried despite the gunfire that suddenly erupted behind them. "Hold on," Atsa commanded, his voice a vibration against her chest. The stallion reared, its hooves pawing the air, before bolting toward the edge of town. A bullet whizzed past them, kicking up a spray of red dust near the horse's flank. Another struck a rain barrel with a hollow thunk. Rowan squeezed her eyes shut and tightened her grip, burying her face deeper into his back. She felt the muscles of his torso shift and bunch as he guided the animal with his knees, weaving through the scattering crowd and past the line of stunned soldiers. They cleared the town limits in seconds, the shouting of Sheriff Maddox and the screams of the townsfolk fading into the rush of the wind. They rode hard. The landscape of the New Mexico territory blurred into streaks of ochre and burnt sienna. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on them with a physical weight. Rowan had ridden horses before, but never like this. Atsa rode as if he were part of the animal, his body absorbing the shock of the gallop, moving in perfect synchronization with the beast. Rowan was forced to cling to him for survival. Every stride threw her against him. Her thighs burned from the strain, and her hands were locked together over his stomach. It was an intimacy born of necessity. Yet, in the terror of the moment, she became acutely aware of the heat radiating from him. He was a solid anchor in a world that had just thrown her away. They rode for 2 hours without stopping, putting miles of broken rock and scrub brush between them and Red Mesa. The terrain grew wilder. The flat plains gave way to jagged mesas and deep arroyos that sliced through the earth like scars. The sky began to darken, not with night, but with a brooding, bruised purple in the west. The wind picked up, carrying the stinging bite of sand. "Storm is coming," Atsa shouted over the rising gale. He slowed the horse to a trot, guiding it toward a cluster of sandstone formations that jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. The temperature plummeted. In the desert, the weather could turn violent in the blink of an eye. The blue sky vanished, swallowed by a wall of churning red dust that stretched from the ground to the heavens. "Get down," Atsa said, pulling the horse to a halt in the lee of a massive overhang. He slid off and reached for her. Rowan's legs were trembling so badly she nearly collapsed when her boots hit the ground. Atsa caught her, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary to steady her. "The sand will cut like glass," he warned, his dark eyes scanning the approaching wall of dust. "We have to wait it out." He led the horse into a deep crevice in the rock, then pulled a heavy buffalo hide blanket from his saddle roll. He gestured for Rowan to sit against the back wall of the shallow cave. The storm hit with a howl that sounded like 1,000 screaming spirits. The light was extinguished instantly, replaced by a suffocating twilight of swirling grit. Atsa sat beside her and threw the heavy blanket over both of them, sealing them into a small, dark cocoon. The space beneath the hide was intimate and hushed, a sharp contrast to the fury outside. It was pitch black. Rowan could see nothing, but she could feel him. He was everywhere. His shoulder pressed against hers, his knee brushing her thigh. The air in the small space warmed quickly with their body heat. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was right at her ear, low and rough. "I do not think so," Rowan whispered. She was shivering, partly from the sudden drop in temperature and partly from the adrenaline crash. "My wrists burn." "I will tend to them when the wind dies," he said. A particularly violent gust slammed against the rock, and Rowan flinched, instinctively leaning into him. Atsa did not pull away. Instead, his arm moved, finding her in the dark. His hand settled on the nape of her neck, his thumb resting against the pulse point of her throat. It was a protective gesture, grounding her. "Do not fear the wind," he murmured. "It cleans the land. It hides our tracks." Rowan closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing. It was slow, controlled. In the absolute darkness, with the smell of leather and man filling her senses, the barrier between them, the barrier of race, of culture, of the war brewing outside, seemed too thin. She was just a woman, frightened and cold, and he was the man who had saved her. They sat like that for an hour, huddled together against the stone, sharing the same air. When the wind finally died down to a low moan, Atsa pulled the blanket back. The world outside was coated in a layer of fine red powder. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the desert. "We must move," Atsa said, standing up and offering her a hand. "My people are close." They rode for another hour as the stars began to puncture the indigo sky. Atsa guided the horse down a narrow, treacherous path that wound into the heart of a deep canyon. This was a place no cavalry map showed, a secret fold in the earth protected by towering walls of red stone. As they reached the canyon floor, the harsh landscape softened. The sound of trickling water greeted them. Tall cottonwood trees, their leaves turning gold in the autumn chill, lined a small stream. Beneath the shelter of the cliffs lay a camp of perhaps 30 people, whippolas made of brush and hide, smoke curling lazily from cooking fires. Atsa rode into the center of the camp. Silence rippled outward as people noticed the white woman sitting behind him. He halted the horse and slid down, then reached up to help Rowan. As her feet touched the soft earth of the canyon floor, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. These were not the curious stares of children. They were the hard, suspicious glares of people who had been hunted. A woman stepped forward. She was older, her face a map of deep lines, but her eyes were sharp. Beside her was a young man who looked like a younger, angrier version of Atsa. "Why have you brought this here, Atsa?" the young man demanded in English, spitting the words. "Is she a prisoner or a shield?" "She is neither." "Nalin," Atsa replied calmly, stepping between Rowan and his cousin. "She is Bilagana," Nalin sneered, using the Navajo word for a white person. "She belongs to the town that starves us. Tie her up before she runs back to tell the soldiers where we sleep." Two other men stepped forward, rope in their hands. Rowan took a step back, her heart leaping into her throat. She had just escaped one set of ropes. She could not bear another. "Stop!" Atsa's voice cracked like a whip. He did not draw a weapon, but his stance shifted, lethal and ready. "No one touches her." "She is the enemy," the older woman said, her voice cold. "She is the reason we are not walking into a massacre," Atsa declared, his voice ringing through the canyon. He looked around the circle of faces. She stood in their square and spoke the truth when her own people would not. She heard their plans to trap us in the Red Canyon. She paid for that truth with her freedom. He gestured to Rowan's wrists, raw and bloody from the sheriff's rope. "Look at her," Atsa commanded. Does the enemy bleed for us? She rides with me. She is under my protection. Anyone who wishes to harm her must go through me first. The challenge hung in the air. Nayland glared at Atsa, his jaw working, but he eventually looked away and spat on the ground before turning on his heel. The tension broke, though the suspicion remained. From the shadows of a nearby tent, a young girl emerged. She walked hesitantly toward Rowan. Rowan recognized her instantly. It was Luyu, the girl who used to come to the store with her parents to trade wool for sugar. "Miss Rowan?" Luyu whispered, her eyes wide. Rowan let out a breath she did not know she was holding. "Hello, Luyu." Luyu looked at the older woman. "She is kind. Grandmother. She gave me peppermint sticks. She is not like the others." The older woman looked from the girl to Rowan, her expression softening just a fraction. "Then she needs water and medicine for those wrists." Later, by the light of a small fire near Atsa's shelter, Rowan sat on a log while Luyu and Atsa tended to her. Luyu washed the dust from Rowan's face with a cool, damp cloth, while Atsa inspected her wrists. The rope had rubbed the skin raw, leaving angry red welts that oozed blood. Atsa produced a small clay pot containing a pungent green salve. "This will sting," he said softly. He took her hand in his. His fingers were large and calloused, rough against her skin, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He applied the salve with a feather-light stroke. Rowan hissed in pain, her breath catching. Atsa paused, looking up. His face was inches from hers. In the firelight, the sharp angles of his cheekbones were softened. She could see the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured. He blew softly on the wound to cool the stinging. The sensation of his breath on her skin sent a shiver down Rowan's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She watched his hands that could fire an arrow with deadly precision now working with such tenderness. The smell of him filled her head again. Wood smoke and masculinity. "Why did they do this?" Atsa asked, not looking up as he began to wrap her wrist in clean linen. "Why did they turn on one of their own?" Rowan swallowed, her throat dry. "Because I heard them. Pritchard and Maddox, they were drinking in the saloon. An older man, the chief of this small band, had joined them. He sat on a blanket, smoking a pipe. He listened intently. Rowan looked at the chief, then at Atsa. They planned to burn the wagons themselves. They wanted to make it look like you did it. They said if the people were scared enough, they would demand the army come in and clear the land." She looked down at her hands, guilt washing over her. "I knew days ago. I heard them planning it, but I was too afraid to stop it. I am sorry. If I had spoken sooner." The chief exhaled a long plume of smoke. "Fear is a heavy blanket," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves rustling together. "It keeps many alive, but sometimes, if you wear it too long, it smothers whole nations." "I tried to tell them today," Rowan said, tears stinging her eyes. "But it was too late." "It is not too late," Atsa said firmly. He finished tying the bandage and held her hand for a moment longer than he needed to. "You are here. You brought the truth." "But they called me a traitor," Rowan whispered. "My father. He looked at me like I was a stranger." Atsa released her hand and sat back, staring into the fire. "I know that look. I saw it on the faces of the soldiers when they came to our valley 3 winters ago. They told us we had to move to the reservation at Bosque Redondo. They said it was for our own good." He picked up a stick and poked at the embers. "We walked for weeks. The snow was deep. My little sister, Shadi, was only 6. She caught the coughing sickness. I carried her for 3 days on my back because she was too weak to walk. When she died, the ground was too frozen to dig a grave. We had to leave her under a pile of stones." Rowan covered her mouth, her heart aching for him. Atsa looked at her, the fire reflecting in his eyes, burning with a quiet, intense resolve. "I swore then that I would never let them take another foot of ground. I swore I would be the monster they fear if that is what it takes to keep my people alive. If they want a savage, I will wear the war paint, but I will not let them erase us." Rowan reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. It was a bold move, But she could not help herself. "You are not a monster, Atsa." He looked down at her hand, pale against his dark skin. He did not pull away. "To them, I am, and now, to them, you are too." The camp settled into the night. Bowls of mutton stew were passed around. It was simple food, gamey and rich. But Rowan ate it gratefully. The hostility in the camp had waned slightly, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts to look at the woman with hair the color of dried wheat. Atsa sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He translated the quiet conversations around the fire for her. He told her they were joking about Nolan's bad luck in hunting rabbits. It was a mundane, human moment that made the violence of the day feel 1,000 miles away. But the sky had not finished with them. Around midnight, the storm returned with a vengeance. Thunder cracked like a cannon shot, shaking the canyon walls. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cliffs in stark, skeletal white. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, tearing at the shelters. "Come," Atsa said, grabbing Rowan's hand. "The wind is too strong for the outer fires." He led her to a small structure tucked against the canyon wall. It was a lean-to made of cedar branches and heavy buffalo hides. Inside, it was small, barely big enough for 2 people to lie down. They crawled in as the rain began to fall in sheets, hammering against the leather roof. The temperature dropped sharply again. Rowan sat on the furs spread on the ground, hugging her knees. The damp cold seeped into her bones. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Atsa secured the flap of the tent and turned to her. In the flashes of lightning that bled through the seams of the hide, she saw his concern. He reached for a large fur robe, the same one they had used earlier, but heavier. "It is cold," he said simply. He lay down and held the robe open. It was an invitation, born of survival, but charged with something else. Rowan hesitated for only a second. She lay down beside him. He pulled the heavy fur over them, tucking it in tight to trap their body heat. "It is too big," he murmured, his voice rumbling in the dark space. "Like me, but it will keep you warm." The space was tiny. Rowan had to press her back against his chest to fit. He curled his body around hers, a protective spoon. She could feel every hard line of him, his broad chest, his strong thighs. The heavy arm he draped over her waist to pull her closer. Her heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat that she was sure he could feel against his arm. Being this close to a man who was not her husband, was forbidden in her world. It was scandalous. But here, in the dark, with the storm raging outside and the scent of him filling her lungs, it felt like the only right thing in the world. She shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable. Her movement brought her hips back against him. Atsa drew a sharp breath. His arm tightened around her waist, his hand splaying flat against her stomach. "Rowan," he whispered. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded rough and sweet on his tongue. She turned in his arms, shifting so she was facing him. It was too dark to see his features clearly, but she could feel his breath on her face. Their noses brushed. "Atsa," she breathed. The air between them crackled, hotter than the lightning outside. The unspoken attraction that had sparked when their eyes met across the town square was now a roaring fire. His hand moved up from her waist, sliding along the curve of her spine, up into her hair. He cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the loose strands. "You should not be here," he whispered, his voice strained. "It is dangerous." "I have nowhere else to go," she replied softly. "You cut me loose." "I did," he admitted. His forehead rested against hers. "And now I do not know if I can let you go." He lowered his head. His lips brushed hers, a tentative, questioning touch. It was soft, surprisingly so for a man of war. Rowan let out a small, shaky sigh and leaned into him, her hand finding the front of his shirt, gripping the leather. At her response, a low groan vibrated in his throat. He kissed her then, truly kissed her. It was deep and hungry, tasting of desperation and the wild, frantic need to affirm life in the face of death. His mouth was hot, demanding, and Rowan met him with equal fire, opening to him, her body arching instinctively against his warmth. The storm raged on outside, wind and rain lashing the earth, but inside the small shelter, there was only the heat of two people trying to forget the world that wanted to tear them apart. The darkness swallowed them, leaving only touch, breath, and the beating of two hearts that had found a matching rhythm in the chaos. The silence of the canyon, once a balm to Rowan Hart's battered spirit, had begun to feel like a cage. 3 days had passed since the storm. 3 days of healing salves and quiet meals by the fire. Her mind remained back in Red Mesa. Trapped in the moment, the rope had tightened around her wrists. She stood by the stream, watching the water rush over smooth red stones. The physical wounds were fading, the raw burns on her wrists were now scabbing over, and the bruise on her cheek was turning a mottled yellow, but the anger was fresh. Atsa approached her from the cottonwood grove. He moved with that silent, predatory grace that still unnerved her, though she no longer feared it. He was stringing a new bow, the wood bending under his powerful hands. "You pace like a trapped wolf," Atsa said, not looking up from his work. "I cannot stay here." "Atsa," Rowan said, turning to face him. Her voice was steady, hardened by the days of reflection. "I cannot hide in the rocks while Pritchard and Maddox rewrite the truth. Every day I am gone, their lie grows roots. They will say I confessed. They will say I led you to slaughter." Atsa stopped his work. He looked at her, his obsidian eyes dark with a mixture of frustration and protectiveness. "You are safe here. My people do not trust you easily, but they have accepted you. Why run back to the wolves? Because if they have framed me once, they will frame your people for everything," Rowan insisted. She stepped closer to him, ignoring the curious glances of two warriors repairing a saddle nearby. "I heard the scouts talking this morning. There is a second convoy preparing to leave Red Mesa. Pritchard claims it is supplies for the miners, but your men say the wagons are riding heavy on the axles." Atsa's jaw tightened. "It is not supplied. It is a rifle, and heavy cannons. They mean to move them through the southern pass, right along the edge of our winter grazing lands." "It is bait," Rowan said, the realization chilling her blood. "Just like the payroll wagon. They want you to attack it. If you strike a government convoy carrying aid, the army will have the justification to wipe this canyon off the map. Then we will strike them before they reach the pass," Atsa said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "We will burn the wagons in the open plain." "No," Rowan countered. "That is what they want. Violence only proves their story. We need proof, Atsa. We need the paper trail. Pritchard is arrogant. He keeps records. I saw him writing letters to the railroad company, bragging about how cheap the land would be once the Indian problem was solved." Atsa stared at her for a long moment. He saw the fire in her gray eyes, a reflection of his own stubbornness. He wanted to forbid her, to keep her locked away in the safety of the sandstone walls. But he knew he could not tame the wind, and he could not tame Rowan Hart. "Red Mesa is crawling with soldiers," he said finally. "To go back is to walk into the throat of the lion." "Then we had better walk quietly," Rowan replied. They reached the outskirts of Red Mesa 2 nights later, under the cover of a moonless sky. The town felt different now. It was no longer her home. It was a fortress of hostility. The windows of the houses were dark, shut tight against the fear of the savage threat the mayor had manufactured. They left the horses in a dry wash a mile out and proceeded on foot. Atsa moved like a shadow, guiding Rowan through the alleyways she had played in as a child. Every creak of a loose board, every bark of a stray dog made Rowan's heart slam against her ribs. They reached the back of the Golden Nugget Saloon. The music inside was loud, a discordant piano tune clashing with the raucous laughter of soldiers. Rowan tossed a small pebble at the window of the storeroom. A moment later, the door creaked open. Elsie peered out, her face pale in the gloom. When she saw Rowan, she nearly dropped the bucket of slop she was holding. "Rowan," Elsie hissed, pulling her into the shadows of the doorframe. "Have you lost your mind? The sheriff has a bounty on you. $50, dead or alive. I am not dead yet, Rowan whispered. She grabbed her friend's hand. Elsie, I need the key to the town hall back door. I know you keep the spare for the cleaning crew. Elsie looked past Rowan to the dark shape of Atsa standing guard by the rain barrel. She swallowed hard, fear warring with loyalty. Pritchard is in the saloon drinking with Briggs, but Maddox is on patrol. If he finds you— He won't, Rowan said. Please, Elsie, this ends tonight. Elsie fumbled in her apron pocket and pressed a heavy iron key into Rowan's palm. Be quick, the cleaning shift starts at 5 o'clock in the morning. Rowan nodded and slipped back into the darkness. Atsa was at her side instantly. You trust her? He asked slowly. She is afraid, Rowan said, but she is good. They moved to the town hall, a 2-story wooden structure that served as both the mayor's office and the courthouse. The square out front was empty, save for the hitching post where Rowan had been tied. She paused for a second, staring at the dark wood, the phantom pain throbbing in her wrists. Atsa's hand touched the small of her back, a silent anchor. Do not look at it, he whispered. Look forward. Rowan unlocked the back door, and they slipped inside. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and beeswax. They crept up the stairs to Pritchard's office. Rowan lit a kerosene lamp, keeping the flame low and shielding it with her body. She began to rifle through the desk. Ledgers, mining claims, tax records, nothing incriminating. Hurry, Atsa murmured from the window, where he was watching the street. I am trying, Rowan snapped softly. She pulled open the bottom drawer. It was locked. She looked around for a tool, but Atsa was already there. He slid his hunting knife into the gap and twisted. The lock gave way with a sharp crack. Inside was a leather folio. Rowan opened it, her hands trembling. There it was, a map of the territory, but with new lines drawn in red ink. The lines cut directly through the Navajo Canyon, labeled Railroad Right-of-Way, pending clearance. Beneath it was a letter addressed to the Western Pacific Railroad Company, to the Board of Directors. Regarding the obstruction at Red Mesa, the local population has been sufficiently agitated. A military solution is imminent. Expect the land to be cleared of hostiles by the 1st of November. The contract for the land transfer is enclosed. He sold us, Rowan whispered, rage boiling in her chest. He sold the land before he even had it. Rowan, Atsa warned. His voice was urgent. She looked up. Through the window, she saw the flare of a match in the street below. Sheriff Cole Maddox and Captain Harlan Briggs were standing on the boardwalk, lighting cigars. They were walking toward the town hall. They are coming in, Atsa said. Panic flared, but Atsa extinguished it with action. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. He grabbed Rowan's arm and pulled her toward the door, but heavy boots were already thudding on the stairs. The back way is cut off, Atsa noted, his voice calm but tight. He pulled her to the window. It opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the side of the building, leading to the roof of the adjacent livery stable. Go, he commanded. Rowan climbed out, her skirts bunching around her knees. The drop was 15 feet. She scrambled along the ledge, the wood slick with the night dew. Atsa followed, closing the window just as the office door handle turned. Who is in there? Maddox's voice roared from inside the room. Atsa grabbed Rowan's waist and jumped. They landed heavily on the stable roof, the impact jarring Rowan's teeth. They rolled, sliding down the gentle slope of the shingles, and dropped into the pile of hay in the alleyway between the buildings. Hey! A voice shouted from the street. Atsa did not hesitate. He knocked an arrow and fired not at a man, but at a hanging oil lantern on the far side of the street. The lantern shattered, oil spilling and igniting with a whoosh. The sudden flare of fire caused the horses at the hitching rail to panic and rear. Fire! Someone screamed. In the confusion, Atsa dragged Rowan into the livery stable through a side door. It was dark inside, smelling of sweet hay and manure. He pulled her into the furthest stall, pushing her into the corner and pressing his body against hers to shield her from view. The stable door burst open. Sheriff Maddox strode in, gun drawn. Search the loft, Maddox shouted to a deputy. "They are here somewhere. I smelled savage." Rowan stopped breathing. She was pressed against the rough wood of the stall wall, with Atsa's solid, muscular frame pinning her in place. His hand came up to cover her mouth, not forcefully, but with a desperate necessity. They stood in absolute silence in the dark. Rowan could feel the rapid, heavy thud of his heart against her chest, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. His body was tense as a drawn bowstring, ready to violence if discovered. Maddox walked past their stall. He was so close Rowan could smell the whiskey on his breath. He paused, looking into the shadows. Atsa's hand tightened slightly on her face. His other hand gripped the handle of his knife. "Nothing here. Sheriff," the deputy called from the loft. Maddox cursed. "Check the alley again. They could not have gone far." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut. Rowan sagged, her knees giving way. Atsa did not move away. He kept her pinned, waiting, listening to ensure they were truly gone. In the quiet, the adrenaline began to shift into something else. Rowan became acutely aware of the length of his body against hers. The heat of him seemed to burn through her dress. She looked up. His eyes were adjusting to the gloom, staring down at her with an intensity that made her lightheaded. He slowly removed his hand from her mouth. "You are reckless," he breathed, the words rough. "You could have been killed." "I got the map," Rowan whispered, clutching the folio to her chest. "I got it, Atsa." "To hell with the map," he growled. His hand moved to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "When I heard them on the stairs, when I thought they would take you again." He did not finish the sentence. The anger in his voice cracked, revealing a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He was a warrior who faced death daily, but the thought of her in Maddox's hands terrified him. Rowan reached up, tangling her fingers in the leather fringe of his shirt. "They did not take me. I am with you." He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. The jealousy, the fear, the relief, it all coalesced into a potent, magnetic pull. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "We must go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "Before they come back." They retrieved the horses and rode hard until the lights of Red Mesa were just a faint glow on the horizon. They stopped at a small stream sheltered by a grove of willows, miles away from the danger. Rowan slid from the horse, her legs shaking. She walked to the water's edge and knelt, splashing the cold water on her face to wash away the sweat and the dust of the town. When she stood up, turning to dry her face on her sleeve, she found Atsa watching her. The moon had risen, casting a silvery light over the clearing. He stood by the horse, one hand on its neck, but his gaze was fixed on her. It was not the look of a protector this time. It was the look of a man seeing a woman. He took in the damp tendrils of hair clinging to her neck, the heave of her chest, the water droplets glistening on her skin. Rowan felt a flush rise from her collarbone. The danger had stripped away the pretenses of society. Out here, there was no shopkeeper's daughter and Navajo warrior. There was only flesh and blood and the survival that bound them. Atsa walked toward her. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him in the cool night air. "Rowan," he said. It was a question and a declaration all at once. He reached out, his hand cupping her face. This time, there was no hesitation. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the storm. That had been a desperate comfort. This was possession. It was deep and slow, a claim of the space between them. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Rowan melted into him, her hands sliding up to grip his shoulders, pulling him closer. The kiss went on, deepening, tasting of the wildness of the night. Rowan felt a fire ignite in her belly, a hunger she had never known. She wanted to stay here, in this circle of moonlight, and forget the war, the railroad, and the hatred. But Atsa pulled back. He was breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were shaking slightly where they held her waist. "If we survive this," he whispered, his voice rasping against her lips, I will ask you properly. I will bring horses to your father. I will stand before your people and mine." Rowan's heart swelled. "You do not need to bring horses, Atsa. You just need to bring yourself. I will do it right," he insisted, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You deserve honor, not hiding in the dark." He kissed her forehead, a seal on the promise, and stepped back. The distance felt cold instantly. "We must ride. The sun will bring the convoy." Back in Red Mesa, the mood was foul. Elias Pritchard stood in the center of his wrecked office. Papers were scattered across the floor like dead leaves. The safe was open. The drawer was splintered. "They took the map," Pritchard said, his voice deadly quiet. "And the correspondence." Sheriff Maddox kicked a chair, sending it skittering across the room. "The savage was here. I told you. He has help." Pritchard turned slowly. His eyes landed on the spare key hanging on the hook by the door, the key that was supposed to be in the possession of the cleaning staff. "Get the waitress," Pritchard ordered. "The blonde one from the saloon, Elsie." 10 minutes later, 2 deputies dragged Elsie into the office. She was weeping, her nightgown thrown over with a hastily grabbed coat. Pritchard approached her, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. "You gave them the key," he stated. I don't know what you mean," Elsie sobbed. "Do not lie to me, girl," Pritchard hissed. "Rowan Hart was here." She took things that belonged to the railroad, and now she and her pet savage are going to try to use them. He released her with a shove. "Lock her up and tell her family that if the papers are not returned, accidents happen in this town. Fire starts so easily in this wind." Pritchard turned to Captain Briggs, who was inspecting the broken lock. "The convoy leaves at dawn," Pritchard said. "Double the guard. If they have the map, they know the route. They will try to stop us." "Let them try," Briggs said, checking the action of his revolver. "We will be ready." The sun rose blood red over the canyon the next morning. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and dust. In the Navajo camp, the warriors were painting their faces, black for war, red for blood. They checked their rifles, their bows, their knives. The women were gathering the children, moving them deeper into the caves. Rowan stood by Atsa's horse. He was tying a feather to the mane. "They are coming with 50 men," Rowan said, "and a Gatling gun. I saw it on the manifest." "We know the land," Atsa replied, tightening the cinch. "We will collapse the walls of the pass. We will trap them." "And then what?" Rowan asked. "You kill 50 soldiers. The United States Army will send 5,000 next week. They will burn everything. Then we die fighting," Atsa said, looking at her. "Better that than to die kneeling." "There is another way," Rowan pleaded. She grabbed his arm. "Let me ride out. Let me stand in the middle. I have the papers. I have the proof. If I can show the soldiers, the common men, not Briggs, that they are dying for a lie, they might stop." "It is suicide," Atsa said, shaking his head. "Briggs will shoot you before you open your mouth." "Someone has to try," Rowan said, her voice breaking. "Or there will only be bodies. Yours, mine, Luyu's, everyone's." Atsa looked at her. He saw the same stubbornness that had made her speak up in the square. He saw the woman who had ridden into the storm with him. "You are a warrior," he said softly, a note of awe in his voice. "In your own way." He swung onto his horse and pulled her up behind him. "We ride," Atsa said, "but stay behind me until I say, if we die today, Rowan Hart, we die together." They rode out of the canyon, a small band of 30 warriors against the might of the coming industrial age, riding toward the red road where the destiny of the territory would be written in blood and ink. The heavy iron wheels of the supply wagons ground against the stone floor of the Red Canyon, the sound echoing off the towering walls like the growl of a waking beast. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with unshed rain, trapping the heat in the narrow gorge. It was a suffocating, electric atmosphere, the kind that made horses bite at their bits and men loosen the collars of their uniforms. Captain Harlan Briggs rode at the head of the column, his eyes scanning the ridges. Behind him, 50 cavalrymen rode in tense formation, their hands hovering near the carbines scabbarded at their knees. In the center of the convoy, Mayor Elias Pritchard sat on the seat of a buckboard wagon, wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Sheriff Cole Maddox rode beside him, his shotgun resting across his saddle horn, his eyes bloodshot and restless. They were looking for an ambush. They were looking for a reason to unleash the Gatling gun that was tarped and lashed to the rear wagon. They found Rowan Hart instead. She appeared from behind a blind curve in the trail, sitting astride a roan mare she had borrowed from the Navajo herd. She wore a borrowed buckskin jacket over her torn dress, her hair braided back like a warrior's, but her face was unmistakably that of the shopkeeper's daughter. She spurred her horse to the center of the narrow road, blocking the path of the lead riders. "Halt!" she screamed, her voice cracking with the strain. "Stop the wagons! This is a lie! It is a trap you built yourselves!" Captain Briggs raised his hand, signaling the column to stop. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the snort of horses and the wind whistling through the crevices of the rock. "Miss Hart," Briggs said, his voice cold and hard, "you are interfering with a United States military operation. Step aside, or you will be treated as a hostile combatant." "Look around you, Captain," Rowan shouted, gesturing to the cliffs. "You are marching these men into a slaughter for a railroad contract. Pritchard sold this land before the treaty was even broken. I have the proof." "She is deranged," Pritchard yelled from the wagon, standing up. "She has been with the savages too long. She has turned against her own blood. Arrest her. Captain, shoot her if she resists." "Take her," Briggs ordered two of his lieutenants. "If you touch her, the sky will rain arrows." A deep voice boomed from above. Every head snapped upward. On the high ridges of the canyon, emerging from the camouflage of the red stone, stood Atsa Nez and 30 Navajo warriors. They did not scream war cries. They did not wave axes. They stood in perfect, disciplined silence, their bows drawn, the iron tips of their arrows glinting in the dull light. Atsa stood at the center, his Winchester rifle held easily in one hand, looking down at the soldiers like a judge peering from a high bench. The soldiers panicked. Horses danced sideways. Carbines were pulled from scabbards. The click of hammers cocking echoed down the line. "Hold your fire!" Briggs roared. Realizing his tactical disadvantage, the Navajo had the high ground. The soldiers were fish in a barrel. Pritchard's face twisted into a sneer. He climbed down from the wagon, confident that the army's firepower would eventually win out. "See," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Rowan. "She rides with them now. She led you into this trap. She is a traitor to her race and her country." Rowan reached into her saddlebag. "I am a traitor to nothing but your greed." "Elias." She pulled out the leather folio she had stolen from his office. With a defiant cry, she hurled it onto the dusty ground between her horse and Captain Briggs. The leather flap fell open. Papers maps with red ink lines. Letters signed with the seal of the railroad company spilled out, fluttering in the rising wind. "Read it," Rowan screamed. "It is all there. The letters to the investors, the plan to fake the attacks. He calls you disposable assets. Captain, he calls your men necessary casualties to clear the title." A young private near the front looked down at a paper that had blown near his horse's hooves. He looked up at Briggs, his eyes wide. "Sir, this letter, it says the attacks were staged." "Do not read that trash, soldier," Maddox bellowed, spurring his horse forward. "It is a forgery, a trick." The tension stretched to the breaking point. The soldiers were wavering. The truth was lying in the dirt, staring them in the face. Then, fear pulled the trigger. A young horse, spooked by Maddox's sudden movement, reared. Its rider, a terrified corporal, lost his grip on his rifle. The gun hit the stone and discharged with a deafening crack. The sound shattered the world. "Ambush!" a sergeant screamed. The soldiers opened fire blindly at the ridges. The Navajo warriors, assuming the attack had begun, released their arrows. The canyon erupted. "Get down!" Atsa's voice tore through the noise, but he was too far away. Rowan's horse bolted, terrified by the gunfire. She was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. Bullets whined off the rocks around her. Splinters of stone and wood flew through the air as the soldiers fired into the cliffs and the warriors fired back into the convoy. Rowan scrambled on her hands and knees, trying to find cover. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Through the haze, a dark shape lunged at her. It was Sheriff Cole Maddox. He had dismounted, abandoning his horse in the chaos. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. He did not want to shoot her. That was too quick. He grabbed her by the braid of her hair, yanking her head back so hard she saw stars. "You want to be the center of attention, girl," Maddox hissed, his breath hot and reeking of tobacco. "I will give you a show." He dragged her across the road, ignoring the bullets zipping past them. There was an old, withered juniper tree growing out of a fissure in the canyon wall, its trunk twisted and scarred. Maddox slammed Rowan against it. He pulled a length of rawhide from his belt. "Look at your Indian whore now," he screamed, his voice rising above the din of battle. He lashed her wrists to the tree, just as he had tied her to the post in the square. But this was not a ceremony of shame. It was an execution. He wanted her to die helpless, watching the people she tried to save be slaughtered. Rowan kicked at him, landing a boot on his shin, but he backhanded her across the face. Her head snapped to the side, blood filling her mouth. "Stay there and watch them die," Maddox spat. He turned, raising a shotgun toward the ridge where Atsa was firing. Rowan sagged against the ropes, her vision blurring. She saw bodies falling, soldiers in blue, warriors in buckskin. It was a massacre, just as she had feared. Then, movement on the cliff caught her eye. Atsa Nez stopped firing. He saw her. He saw the sheriff standing over her. Atsa dropped his rifle. He did not seek cover. He did not flank. He jumped. He slid down the steep scree slope, a landslide of red rock following him. He hit the canyon floor running, drawing his bow as he moved. He did not run toward safety. He ran straight into the middle of the road, placing himself directly between the firing lines. He stood tall, chest heaving, his bow drawn but not aimed. He presented himself as a target to every soldier in the canyon. "Stop!" Atsa roared, his voice immense, carrying the weight of 100 years of silence. The sheer audacity of it stunned the combatants. A single warrior standing in the open. The shooting faltered, then stopped, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the ringing in ears. Atsa looked at Captain Briggs, then at Maddox. "You shoot her!" Atsa shouted, pointing his bow at Rowan, then turning it to encompass the folio scattered on the ground. "You shoot the only truth you have left." He turned his back on the soldiers and looked up at his warriors. He shouted a command in Dine. 30 bows shifted. They stopped aiming at the soldiers. Every arrow on the ridge swung to point directly at two men, Mayor Elias Pritchard and Sheriff Cole Maddox. It was a shift in gravity. The enemy was no longer the white race. The enemy was the corruption within it. Captain Briggs looked at the papers on the ground, then at the mayor cowering behind a wagon wheel. He looked at the brave man standing in the open. Briggs lowered his pistol. "Stand down," Briggs ordered his men. "Cease fire, I said, cease fire." "No," Pritchard shrieked, scrambling for a fallen rifle. Kill them all, that is an order." "You have no authority here," Elias Briggs barked. Sheriff Maddox, seeing his power crumbling, went mad. He raised his shotgun, not at Atsa, but at Rowan tied to the tree. "If I go down, she goes with me." "Drop it, Maddox," Briggs shouted, raising his gun again. "Stand down or die," Atsa yelled, pulling his bowstring to his cheek. Rowan looked at the barrel of the shotgun. She looked at Atsa, who was ready to die to save her. And she realized she was not just a victim to be saved. She was a fighter. "If you kill him, you prove everything I said is true," Rowan screamed. Maddox's finger tightened on the trigger. Rowan gathered every ounce of strength she had left. She did not pull away from the tree. She threw her weight forward, using the leverage of her tied wrists. She launched herself feet first, not at the gun, but at Maddox's knees. It was a desperate, ungraceful move, but it worked. Her boots connected with the sheriff's leg just as the gun went off. The blast went wide. The buckshot missed Rowan's head by inches, shredding the bark of the juniper tree. But the shot did not hit empty air. Mayor Pritchard, who had stood up to scream another order, caught the full force of the blast in his chest. The mayor was thrown backward against the wagon wheel, his silk vest disintegrating in a spray of red. He slid to the ground, his eyes wide with shock, his hand landing on one of the damning letters he had written. Maddox, off balance from Rowan's kick, stumbled back. He tried to rack the slide of his shotgun for another round. He never got the chance. From the ridge, a single arrow flew. It was not Atsa's. It was from the bow of the young man, Nalin. The arrow struck Maddox in the shoulder, spinning him around. Before he could hit the ground, 2 soldiers tackled him, pinning him to the dust. Silence fell over the Red Canyon. It was a heavy, ringing silence. The smoke drifted lazily toward the strip of gray sky. Captain Briggs walked slowly toward the body of the mayor. He picked up a piece of paper from the ground, a contract promising $50,000 to Pritchard upon the successful removal of the Navajo. Briggs looked at it, his face grim, then looked at his men. "Secure the prisoner," Briggs said, pointing at Maddox, "and gather the wounded, ours and theirs." He looked up at the ridge and nodded once, a stiff, formal acknowledgement of the ceasefire. Atsa did not acknowledge the captain. He had no eyes for soldiers or politics. He dropped his bow in the dirt. He walked toward the juniper tree. Rowan was sagging against the ropes, breathing in ragged gasps. Her face was streaked with blood and dust, her hair wild. She looked like a spirit of the canyon itself, broken but unbowed. Atsa stopped in front of her. The soldiers watched. The warriors watched. For the second time in her life, Rowan Hart was tied to a piece of wood, displayed for the world to judge, and for the second time, the same man stood before her. Atsa reached for the knife at his belt. His hand was shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of nearly losing her. "You are hurt," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am alive," Rowan managed to choke out. Atsa stepped in close. He slashed the rawhide ropes with a single, violent motion, freeing her. Rowan fell forward, her legs useless. Atsa caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She felt him trembling. "I thought I lost you," he murmured into her hair. "I thought I lost you." He pulled back slightly, looking at her wrists. They were bleeding again, the old scabs torn open by her struggle. He lifted her hands, his touch infinitely gentle. He bowed his head and pressed his lips to the bloody, bruised skin of her wrist. It was a gesture of reverence, more intimate than any kiss on the mouth. Then he straightened. He did not whisper this time. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying in the canyon acoustic, heard by the captain, the soldiers, and his own people on the cliffs. "I asked you once to ride with me to escape a lie," Atsa said, looking deep into her gray eyes. He gestured to the soldiers, then to the warriors descending from the rocks. "Now, the lie is dead. But the world is still broken." He took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers, his dark skin against her pale skin, a visual defiance of every law the territory held dear. "In front of both our worlds?" Atsa asked, his voice steady and strong. "Will you stand with me?" Rowan looked at the soldiers, who were lowering their guns. She looked at the warriors, who were watching with respect. She looked at the dead body of the man who had tried to sell her home. She squeezed Atsa's hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the pulse of the man who had ridden into hell to save her. "I will stand," Rowan said, her voice clear and ringing. "Today, and every day after." The smoke in the Red Canyon did not clear for a long time. It hung in the air like a gray shroud, trapped between the towering sandstone walls, smelling of sulfur and the copper tang of blood. But the gunfire had stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the nervous stamping of horses. Captain Harlan Briggs stood by the wreckage of the supply wagon. His face was smeared with dust, and his uniform was torn at the sleeve. At his feet lay the body of Mayor Elias Pritchard. The man who had orchestrated the chaos lay staring blindly at the strip of sky. his hand still clutching the fraudulent land contract stained with his own blood. Sheriff Cole Maddox was alive, but he was no longer the law. 2 of Briggs' corporals had him in irons, his shoulder bandaged where Nolan's arrow had struck him. He spat curses at the ground, but his reign of terror was effectively over. Without Pritchard's money and political maneuvering, Maddox was just a thug with a badge, and the army had no patience for thugs who got their soldiers killed. Rowan Hart stood near the canyon wall, leaning against the rough stone for support. Her adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a throbbing pain in her left shoulder where a bullet had grazed her during the initial volley. Atsa Nez stood beside her. He had not left her side since cutting her loose from the juniper tree. He held his rifle loosely, but his eyes were fixed on Captain Briggs. Briggs walked over to them. He moved slowly, a man carrying the weight of a terrible mistake. He stopped 5 paces away, maintaining a respectful distance. "The mayor is dead," Briggs said, his voice flat. "And the sheriff is in custody. I have read the papers. Miss Hart, all of them." Rowan straightened, wincing slightly, and it appears the United States Army has been used as a private mercenary force for a land grab, Briggs admitted. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. "I am a soldier, Miss Hart. I follow orders, but I do not fight wars for profit. The convoy will turn back. We will take the wounded to Fort Wingate." "And the Navajo?" Atsa asked. His voice was hard, giving no ground. Briggs looked at the warrior. There was no hatred in the captain's eyes anymore, only a weary pragmatism. "I cannot speak for the government in Washington, but I can speak for this regiment. We will not attack this canyon. I will submit these documents to the general. There will be an inquiry." The chief of the band, a weathered man with eyes like old flint, stepped forward. He spoke in Dine, his voice sharp and commanding. Atsa turned to Rowan. "He says words on the wind are easily forgotten. He wants it written." Rowan looked at Briggs. "You have paper, Captain, and ink. Write it down. A ceasefire. An acknowledgement that the Navajo acted in self-defense against an illegal incursion." Briggs hesitated, then nodded. He retrieved a field journal from his saddlebag. Leaning against the side of the wagon, he wrote out the terms. It was not a formal treaty. He did not have the authority for that, but it was a military report, signed and dated, stating that the hostilities were provoked by Pritchard and Maddox. He handed the paper to Rowan. She read it, checking every word, before handing it to the chief. "It is done," Briggs said. He signaled to his men. "Move out, we will return to Red Mesa." As the soldiers began the grim task of loading bodies onto the wagons, a young lieutenant approached Rowan. He held a small, folded piece of paper. "Miss Hart," the lieutenant said awkwardly, "a trader came through town yesterday morning, just before we left. He asked me to give this to you if we found you. He said it was from your father." Rowan took the note. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotchy. "Rowan, I was wrong. I was afraid, and my fear made me a coward. I let them take you. I cannot forgive myself, but I pray you can survive. If you are reading this, please come home. The store is empty without you. I will not ask you to be silent again. I only ask you to be my daughter." Thomas Rowan stared at the paper until the words blurred. "We should go," Atsa said softly, touching her uninjured arm. "The sun is dropping." They watched the army column disappear around the bend of the canyon, the dust settling in their wake. The threat was gone, for now. But as Rowan folded the note and placed it in her pocket, she knew a different kind of struggle was just beginning. The ride back to the hidden camp was slow. The victory was real, but the mood was somber. Nayland had been shot in the leg, and 2 other warriors had died in the skirmish. The wailing of their wives echoed off the canyon walls as the party returned, a haunting sound that chilled Rowan to the bone. She felt like an intruder again. These men had died defending a lie that her people had created. When they reached Atsa's shelter, the adrenaline had completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, biting sting of her wound. Her sleeve was stuck to her skin with dried blood. "Sit," Atsa commanded gently, pointing to the pile of furs near the fire. He fetched a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. The camp was settling down, the morning song softening to a low hum in the distance. The firelight danced on the red stone walls, creating a small, intimate world for just the two of them. Atsa knelt beside her. He took a knife and carefully cut away the ruined fabric of her sleeve, exposing her shoulder. Rowan hissed in breath through her teeth. The bullet had furrowed the skin, leaving a deep, angry gash that was red and swollen. "It is not deep," Atsa said, inspecting it with a critical eye. "But it needs cleaning." He dipped the cloth in the water. "This will hurt." "I know," Rowan said. She gripped his knee with her good hand to brace herself. As he cleaned the wound, washing away the grit and blood, Rowan watched his face. He was concentrated, his brow furrowed. He had washed war paint from his face, but the intensity of the warrior remained. "You fought well," he said, his voice low. "You threw yourself at Maddox. It was foolish, but it was brave." "I could not let him kill you," Rowan replied. Atsa paused. His hand rested on her bare shoulder, his thumb brushing the skin near her collarbone. The touch sent a jolt through her that numbed the pain of the wound. "And now," he asked, "the captain offered you a safe return. Your father asks for you." Rowan looked away, staring into the fire. "I do not know if I can go back to being the girl who sells flour and counts pennies. Not after this." "Your people will write their papers," Atsa said. He applied a poultice of herbs to the cut and began to bind it with a strip of linen. "They will want you back to tell the story. You are a hero to them now." "The woman who stopped a war?" "I do not care what they want," Rowan said fiercely. She turned to look at him. "What do you want?" "Atsa." Atsa tied off the bandage. He sat back on his heels, putting a foot of distance between them. He looked conflicted, his jaw tight. "I am a man who lives in a canyon. Rowan. My life is hunting, fighting, and moving when the seasons change. I sleep on the ground. I have no store. I have no silk dresses to give you." "I have had enough silk," Rowan said. "And I have slept on the ground for a week. I have never slept better." "It is different," he insisted. "The winter is hard here, and the peace is a thin sheet of ice. The army will come back, or the settlers. It is a hard life. You have a father who loves you. You have a home." "A home where they tied me to a post," Rowan reminded him. "A home where you belong," Atsa said, though the words seemed to pain him. "I look at you, and I see the sun, but I am the rock. I do not want to be the shadow that dims your light." Rowan reached out and took his hand. "The sun burns without the rock to catch its heat. Atsa, you are not a shadow." He looked at their joined hands, his dark skin against her pale fingers. He did not pull away, but he did not pull her closer. "Rest now," he said, standing up abruptly. "We will talk when the sun rises." He walked away into the darkness to check on the horses, leaving Rowan alone by the fire with her father's letter burning a hole in her pocket. The next 2 days were a blur of recovery. Rowan helped the women prepare food, though her arm was in a sling. She sat with Luyu, teaching the girl English words while Luyu taught her how to weave willow baskets. Everywhere she went, she felt the eyes of the camp on her. They were no longer hostile. The warriors nodded when she passed. The women shared their bread. She had bled with them. She had stood between them and the Gatling gun. She was no longer Bilagana. She was something else. But the question of her future hung over her head like a storm cloud. A trader arrived at the edge of the canyon on the 3rd day, bringing coffee and news. He told Rowan that her father was ill, his heart weak after the shock of the arrest and the beating. "He calls for you, Miss Hart," the trader said. "He says he cannot manage the store alone." Rowan stood at the canyon rim, looking east toward Red Mesa. She could see the faint haze of smoke from the town's chimneys. It was her past calling. Duty, family, the safety of a roof and a bed. Then she looked west, at the red cliffs and the endless sky. Atsa found her there at sunset. The sky was a brilliant tapestry of violet and gold. "The trader is leaving in the morning," Atsa said. "You could ride with him." Rowan turned. She wore a buckskin dress that Luyu's mother had given her, the soft leather hugging her form. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. "Is that what you want?" she asked again. "Do not tell me what is best for me. Tell me what you want." Atsa looked at her for a long time. The stoicism he wore like armor cracked. "Come with me," he said. He led her away from the camp, down a narrow deer trail that led to a small, secluded pool fed by a spring. It was a sacred place, quiet and hidden from the world. He built a small fire, the flames crackling softly. They sat on a blanket, the stars coming out above them like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Atsa picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. "When I cut you free that day in the square," he began, his voice low and rumbling, "I thought I was only taking a witness. I thought I needed you to speak for us. I did not know." He paused, looking at his hands. "I did not know I was taking my heart." Rowan's breath hitched. She moved closer to him. Atsa turned to her. The firelight illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the depth of his eyes. "Every time I looked at you, I saw the danger I was bringing to you. I tried to push you away. I tried to tell myself you belonged to the town. But when I saw Maddox holding that gun to you, I knew." He reached into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out something small that glinted in the firelight. It was a ring. It was not gold or diamond. It was made of silver, beaten and shaped by hand. It was wide and sturdy, engraved with the symbols of mountains and the four winds. It was imperfect, rough in places, but it was beautiful. "I made this," he said shyly, "while you were sleeping. It is Navajo silver. It remembers the fire that made it." He did not kneel. That was not his way. He shifted so he was facing her, sitting cross-legged. He took her hand, the one he had bandaged, and placed the ring in her palm. "I have no house of wood," Atsa said. "I have no money to put in a bank. I have a horse, a bow, and a promise that I will never let anyone tie you down again." He leaned forward slowly until his forehead rested against hers. It was a gesture of shared breath, of shared mind. Rowan closed her eyes, breathing in his scent, feeling the warmth of him seep into her soul. "No debts," he whispered, his breath mingling with hers. "No tribes, just two people. Will you be my wife, Rowan Hart? Will you live between these two worlds with me?" Rowan thought of the store. She thought of her father. She thought of the safe, predictable life she was supposed to live. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the silver ring. It was strong. It was enduring, like the man before her. "The town has walls," Rowan whispered. "I do not want walls anymore." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Yes," she said. It was not a breathless, girlish answer. It was the answer of a woman who had seen death and chosen life. "Yes, Atsa, I will be your wife." Atsa let out a breath that sounded like a shudder. He pulled back just enough to look at her, a fierce joy breaking across his face. "Then we are bound," he said. He kissed her. It was slow and deep, a sealing of a covenant, under the vast canopy of the western sky, with the fire crackling beside them. The differences of language and skin faded away. There was only the touch of his hand on her waist, the taste of him, the overwhelming sense of coming home. He pulled her down onto the blanket. The night air was cool, but the fire in their bodies made a sanctuary of warmth. As he kissed the hollow of her throat, Rowan looked up at the stars. She knew the road ahead would be hard. Her father would be hurt. The town would whisper. The army might return. But as Atsa's arms tightened around her, she knew she could weather any storm. She was no longer the girl trapped between two worlds. She was the bridge that connected them. The next morning, Rowan met the trader at the rim of the canyon. She handed him a letter for her father. "You are not coming?" the trader asked, surprised. "Not today," Rowan said. She looked back toward the camp, where Atsa was waiting for her by the horses. "Tell my father I love him. Tell him I will come to visit soon. But tell him I have found my own place." She watched the trader ride away, then turned back to Atsa. "He will be angry," Rowan said. "He will be a father," Atsa replied. He helped her onto her horse. "He will forgive, and if he does not, we will bring him venison until he does." Rowan laughed, a sound that felt light and free in the canyon air. "Where do we go?" she asked. Atsa pointed to a ridge in the distance, a place where the red rocks met the green of the valley floor, halfway between the canyon stronghold and the town of Red Mesa. "There is a spring there," he said. "Good water, good grass. It is not on the railroad map, and it is close enough that a man can walk to town, but far enough that he cannot hear the gossip." "It sounds like a good place for a house," Rowan said. "A trading post," Atsa corrected, mounting his stallion. "And maybe a place to teach." Rowan smiled, touching the silver ring on her finger. "Yes, a place for both." They kicked their horses into a trot, riding side by side toward the middle ground, leaving the shadows of the past behind them. The sun was rising higher, bathing the New Mexico territory in a light that was harsh, unforgiving, and utterly, breathtakingly beautiful. It was a new day, and for the first time, it belonged to them. 5 years had passed since the guns fell silent in the Red Canyon, and the seasons had worked their slow, grinding magic on the territory of New Mexico. The wind, relentless and eternal, had scrubbed the blood from the rocks. The rains had washed away the soot of the burning wagons. And time, the great healer, had begun to smooth the jagged edges of hatred that once defined the border between the town of Red Mesa and the Navajo lands. The railroad, that great iron beast that had threatened to devour the canyon, had been diverted south. Without the corrupt influence of Elias Pritchard, whose bones now rested in a forgotten grave on the edge of the cemetery, the company had deemed the engineering challenges of the canyon too costly. They laid their tracks through the flats of Arizona instead, leaving Red Mesa to remain what it was always meant to be, a quiet, dusty waypoint on the edge of the wild, on a stretch of fertile land halfway between the town and the towering red cliffs. A new structure had risen. It was not a fortress, nor was it a traditional hogan, but a blend of both worlds. Logs of ponderosa pine formed the walls, sturdy and square like a settler's cabin, but the roof was domed with packed earth and heavy timber, mimicking the shelter of the dine. A wooden sign swung above the gate, creaking rhythmically in the breeze. It had been carved by hand. The letters burned deep into the oak Hartney Trading School. It was here that Rowan Hart now stood, dusting chalk from her hands. The morning sun streamed through the open windows of the schoolroom, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air. Sitting on the rough-hewn benches were 12 children. 6 of them wore the calico dresses and woolen trousers of the town. The other 6 wore the soft buckskin and woven blankets of the canyon. "All right," Rowan said, her voice clear and commanding, though warmed by a patience she had learned over the years. "Who can tell me the word for water in both tongues?" A small hand shot up. It belonged to a boy named Thomas, the son of the town baker. "Water," Thomas said proudly. "And to—" "Very good, Thomas," Rowan smiled. She turned to the chalkboard and wrote the words side by side. English and Navajo, distinct yet sharing the same space. Just like the children in the room, sitting in the front row, swinging her legs which did not yet reach the floor, was a little girl of 4 years. She had hair as black as a raven's wing, thick and straight, but when she looked up, her eyes were the color of a storm cloud, a piercing, intelligent gray. This was Mara. She was the living breath of the treaty between Rowan and Atsa, a child who did not belong to one world or the other, but owned them both. "Mama," Mara chirped, breaking the lesson. "Is Papa coming back today?" Rowan softened. She walked over and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "He is, little bird. He is bringing wool from the canyon to trade for winter flour." The bell on the trading post door rang, signaling a customer. Rowan dismissed the class for their midday break. The children spilled out into the yard, their laughter mixing together English shouts and Navajo calls blending into a single, joyful noise. Rowan watched them for a moment, a profound sense of peace settling in her chest. It was a hard life. They worked from sunrise to sunset. The winters were cold, and there were still men in town who spat when they saw Atsa ride by. But it was a life of their own making. That afternoon, Rowan needed to go into Red Mesa. The trading post was low on salt and coffee, items that Atsa's people prized but could not produce themselves. "I will go with you," a shy voice said. Rowan turned to see Nita, a Navajo girl of 10 years who had been staying at the school to learn reading. Nita was timid, terrified of the town and the Bilagana who lived there. "You do not have to, Nita," Rowan said gently. "I can go alone." "I want to see," Nita said, gripping her shawl tightly. "I want to see where you came from." Rowan nodded. She hitched the mule to the small cart and helped Nita up. Mara stayed behind with her grandfather, Thomas Hart, who had moved out to the homestead 2 years ago. The old man sat on the porch in his rocking chair, whittling a toy horse for his granddaughter, his face lined with age but free of the fear that had once paralyzed him. The road to Red Mesa was familiar, yet every time Rowan traveled it, she felt the ghost of the girl she used to be riding beside her, the girl who had been afraid to speak, the girl who had hidden under the floorboards. They entered the town proper. Red Mesa had not changed much. The Golden Nugget Saloon still stood, though the piano was out of tune. The sheriff's office had a new coat of whitewash. The current sheriff was a man named Miller, a former cattle rancher who cared more about rustlers than racial politics. People stopped to watch the cart pass. A few years ago, there would have been jeers or stones. Now, there was a quiet, begrudging respect. The women in their bonnets nodded stiffly to Rowan. They knew she was the only one who could negotiate fair prices with the Navajo weavers for their blankets. They knew that without the trade she facilitated, the town would have withered when the mine slowed down. Rowan parked the cart in front of the general store, the store her father had sold to a young couple from the east. She helped Nita down. The girl stuck close to Rowan's skirts, her dark eyes darting around nervously. They walked toward the mercantile, but their path took them directly through the town square. The square was empty now, save for a few stray dogs sleeping in the shade, but in the center, protruding from the hard-packed earth like a jagged tooth, stood the old hitching post. It was gray and weathered now. The wood was splitting, dry-rotted from the relentless sun. It was no longer used. Newer, sturdier rails had been built near the boardwalks. It stood there as a relic, a piece of trash that no one had bothered to dig up. Rowan stopped. She could not help it. Every time she walked through this square, her feet slowed as she neared the post. Nita tugged on her hand. "Miss Rowan," the girl whispered. "Why do you always look at that old log?" Rowan stared at the wood. In her mind's eye, the square was not empty. She could hear the roar of the crowd. She could feel the bite of the hemp rope cutting into her wrists. She could feel the shame burning her cheeks as the spittle of her neighbors landed on her dress. She could hear Sheriff Maddox's voice, thick with hate. "Please, let me go," she whispered, the echo of her own plea playing in her memory. But then, the memory shifted. The heat of the sun was replaced by the cool shadow of a horse. The jeers were silenced by a voice that commanded the wind. She saw the flash of the knife. She felt the strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. Rowan reached out and touched the rough wood of the post. It felt dead. It had no power over her anymore. It was just wood. She looked down at Nita, who was watching her with wide, curious eyes. "That is where they tied me." "Nita," Rowan said softly, "a long time ago. They tied me here because I loved the wrong people, because I tried to speak the truth when they wanted a lie." Nita's eyes widened. "Were you scared?" "I was terrified," Rowan admitted. She ran her thumb over a deep groove in the wood. "I thought my life was over. I thought I would die here, alone and hated." Rowan smiled then, a smile that reached her gray eyes and lit them up. "But this is also where a Navajo warrior cut me loose. It is where he put me on his horse, in front of all of them, and asked me to ride beside him instead." She withdrew her hand from the post. "It is a scar." "Nita," Rowan said, looking around the square. But scars show us where we healed. They show us that we survived. A group of soldiers from the nearby garrison walked by. They were young men, fresh recruits who knew nothing of the Red Canyon battle except for the exaggerated stories told around campfires. They saw Rowan standing there, a white woman in buckskin, holding the hand of a Navajo child. One of the soldiers, a corporal with a kind face, tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. Rowan nodded back. "Corporal?" It was a small thing, but it was everything. The world had not become perfect. Prejudice still lingered in the corners of eyes and the hushed whispers of the saloon. But the venom had been drawn out. The war that Pritchard and Maddox had tried to ignite had sputtered and died, suffocated by the stubborn refusal of two people to be enemies. As they finished their shopping and loaded the sacks of salt into the cart, a sound drifted on the wind. It was the rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, not the frantic gallop of a raid, but the steady, confident approach of a rider who knows he is welcome. Rowan turned toward the west end of the street. Atza Nez rode into Red Mesa. He was older now. The sun had etched deeper lines around his eyes, and there were a few threads of silver in his dark hair. But his back was as straight as a lance, and his shoulders were just as broad. He rode a new horse, a sturdy bay stallion that carried packs of wool and woven rugs. He did not ride with a weapon in his hand. His rifle was sheathed. His bow was unstrung. He was not here to fight. He was here to build. He rode past the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, sitting on the porch, looked up from his newspaper and gave a short wave. Atza returned the gesture with a nod. It was a truce held together by mutual utility and the sheer force of Atza's dignity. Atza halted his horse near the cart. He looked down at Nita, then at his wife. "You have been long," Atza said, his voice the low rumble that Rowan loved so much. "Mara is asking for her peppermint sticks." "We were just teaching history," Rowan said, glancing back at the hitching post. Atza followed her gaze. He looked at the rotting wood. For a moment, his face hardened, the memory of seeing her tied there flashing behind his eyes. But then he looked at Rowan free, standing tall, glowing with the quiet strength of a woman who knows exactly who she is. The hardness melted away. "History is for books," Atza said. "We have a wagon to load." Just then, the sound of running feet echoed from the edge of town. Mara had somehow convinced her grandfather to let her run ahead to meet them. She came sprinting down the dusty street, her black hair flying behind her. "Papa!" she screamed. Atza's face broke into a grin that transformed him. He leaned down from the saddle, his movement fluid and practiced. He swept the child up with one arm, settling her in front of him on the saddle. Mara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that seemed to cleanse the air of the square. She grabbed the reins with her small hands, pretending to steer the great beast. "Did you bring the bluestone?" Mara asked. "I brought better," Atza said, kissing the top of her head. "I brought myself." Rowan watched them, the warrior and the child, silhouetted against the setting sun. The light turned the dust of the street into a golden haze. She looked at the town folks who had stopped to watch. She saw a merchant smiling at Mara. She saw a woman pointing out the quality of the rugs on Atza's horse. They were not fully one people. Perhaps they never would be. The scars of the land ran too deep, the history too bloody. But here, in this moment, in this square where she had once begged for her life, there was life. There was a family. Rowan walked over to the horse. Atza reached down and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused, and familiar. The silver ring on her finger caught the last rays of the sun. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Rowan looked back at the hitching post one last time. Then she turned her back on it, fully and completely. "Yes," she said. "Let us go home." They moved out of the town, a small caravan of 3. The cart rattled, the horse snorted, and the laughter of a child drifted on the wind. They headed west, toward the homestead that sat between the rock and the town, toward the school where the alphabet was taught in 2 tongues, and toward a future that they would carve out of the hard earth, together. Rowan Hart had once been tied by shame, but love wild, dangerous, and undeniable had cut her loose, and in the vast, open expanse of the American West, she had found that the only thing worth being bound to was the truth, and the man who had been brave enough to ride into the fire to find it with her. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Wild West Tales. It has been a journey through the dust and drama of the frontier, and I hope Rowan and Atsa's story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you tuning in from a busy city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did you like how they built a bridge between their worlds? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button, and smashing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support keeps the spirit of the Wild West alive. Until next time, keep writing your own path.